The ACC has 3 new programs heading into next season. Can any of Stanford, Cal, or SMU threaten the traditional conference powers on Tobacco Road?
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Tuesday, and welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your solo host for today, Andy Patton. You are joining at the place to get your college basketball content, folks, every single day, 5 days a week, 52 weeks a year, all year long. We are here with you, Locked On College Basketball. Folks, want to thank all of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Remind you that you can check out the show ad-free on Amazon Music if you have not done so yet. And remind you that today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Folks, it is ACC Day today. We've been talking about some of the new additions in various conferences. We talked a lot about Arizona and the rest of the Pac-12 corner schools that are joining the Big 12, what that means for that conference, which is already excellent from a basketball perspective. We had a long conversation about Texas joining the SEC after they landed Arthur Kaluma in the transfer portal, what Rodney Terry's team might look like in their new conference. Want to talk about the ACC's new teams as well. And I know there's a lot of conversation around the ACC right now that's not particularly focused on the 3 newcomers from a basketball perspective. Most of the conversation around the ACC right now is the long-term viability of the conference, what's going on with Florida State and Clemson, Big 12's poking around, Big 10, SEC potentially poking around as well, whether that means Stanford and Cal will get kicked back to the Pac-2 with Washington State and Oregon State. All sorts of conference realignments conversations happening. If you want to hear more about that, Locked On College Football, fantastic host there. Spencer McLaughlin does a really great job of breaking down conference realignment, how it impacts all sports as well. So definitely worth checking out. But right now, what we do know in a sea of uncertainty is that in the 24-25 college basketball season, the Stanford Cardinal, the California Golden Bears, and the SMU Mustangs will compete in the ACC with the likes of North Carolina and Duke and NC State and Virginia and Clemson and everybody else in that conference. So today we're going to break down each of these 3 new teams, talk about their additions this offseason, their departures this offseason, where they might fit in the ACC next season, starting with the Stanford Cardinal, who went 14-18 last year. They went 8-12 in the final season of the Pac-12. They finished the season 105th at Ken Pom. They did not make the NCAA tournament. In fact, they did not make the NCAA tournament for an entire decade. Last time they made the big dance was 2014. Jerod Haase's entire career as the head coach at Stanford. He came over from UAB, been the head coach there for 7-8 seasons, I believe. He is now out the door. We talk key departures, key additions. We're going to focus on players, but 2 of these 3 programs are going to have new coaches next season. Kyle Smith, longtime head coach. He was at Columbia. He was at San Francisco. Most recently, he was at Washington State. He left Washington State after the season. Didn't want to go back to the WCC where he had a lot of coaching experience at San Francisco. Opted instead to take the vacant job at Stanford following Jerod Haase's departure. Kyle Smith is a fantastic coach. I'm not very confident that this Stanford roster is going to be super good next season. They lost a lot of talent. I'm not sure they retained and brought in enough talent to compete jumping from the Pac-12 to the ACC, which is a much better and deeper basketball conference. But I rarely bet against Kyle Smith. He has done more with less at a ton of stops. He succeeded at Columbia, which is a difficult place. He succeeded in the WCC, which is very hard to do if you're not at Gonzaga or St. Mary's. And he succeeded at a previously Power 6 job at Washington State, one of the most difficult places to recruit in all of the high majors. He succeeded there, took them to the NCAA tournament last year as a 7 seed. I do not bet against Kyle Smith. But when looking at this roster, the key departures include Kenan Carlisle, who's now at Indiana. They include Brandon Angel, who's at Oregon, Spencer Jones and Michael Jones, who are both a part of the program. Spencer Jones competing for a spot in the NBA right now. Andrej Stojakovic, who actually transferred to Cal, so we'll talk about him a little bit later. They also lose Max Morrell to Santa Barbara. Tons of very talented players out the door for Stanford. And while I don't dislike their transfer portal class, I'm also not incredibly excited about it either. I think the winner here is probably Chisholm Okpara, who comes from Harvard. Very, very surprising to transfer to Stanford and have it be a step down academically, mind you. This is a very rare example of that happening. Okpara played at Harvard last year. Very good program there. Averaged 16.5 points, 5 boards, 2 assists as a sophomore. He's going to be a quality power forward addition for Kyle Smith. Outside of that, Darren Saran from UC Irvine is solid, 10 points a game last year as a freshman. He's got 3 years of eligibility left. He shot 35% from 3. That's a quality combo guard, 2-guard addition for this program. They get Jalen Blakes from Duke, which I'm very intrigued by. Blake he's played 84 career games for the Blue Devils, but only played about 9.5 minutes per game, averaged just 2.2 points. Can he get unlocked in a new system where doesn't have as much premier talent in front of him the way he did the last few years for the Blue Devils? They also had Isaiah Sellers from USC, who averaged about 5 points, shot about 43% from 3 for the Trojans. And then they had a pair of 3-star freshmen coming in Donovan Young and Anthony Batson. So overall, like I said, I like Kyle Smith a lot. And I think his ability to not only identify talent, but to find players who fit his system. He calls it nerd ball. He's a very analytically focused coach. He's part of a coaching tree at San Francisco that has really spawned a lot of very intelligent, analytics-driven coaches, including his replacement at San Francisco, Todd Golden, who led the Dons to their first NCAA tournament appearance since the 90s. That was back in 2021. And then Todd Golden, of course, left and took the job at Florida and has so far done a very good job with that Gators program. I think that's a team that could take a leap once again this year as well. So Kyle Smith has been the leader of this really analytic-driven college basketball programs, and again, has succeeded in the Ivy League, has succeeded in the WCC, succeeded at a really difficult job in the Pac-12. It would be foolish to assume that he's not capable of succeeding, even at a Stanford program that has historically not dumped a lot of money into men's basketball, that is now competing where they're traveling all the way across the country in the ACC. The long-term viability of their new conference is in question. This is not going to be an easy job, and a lot of these things are going to apply to Cal as well, and SMU for that matter. But for Stanford, this is a tough job. Jerod Haase was very good at bringing in talent. He landed top 40, top 50 caliber players like Stojakovic, like Harrison Ingram, who transferred to North Carolina. They've had many others, but they were unable to consistently win. Kyle Smith's kind of been the opposite in his career, where they don't necessarily land a lot of top 30, top 50 guys, top 4-star, 5-star prospects, but they win. This year's class, this year's freshman class, this year's transfer portal class doesn't pop off the page the way that maybe you'd expect them to, or that you'd want to see for a team that's joining a new conference that's kind of got a refresh with the coach who's had a lot of success. But again, a lot of Kyle Smith's success has not been on the back of 4- and 5-star talent. So it'll be very interesting to see what this roster, with a ton of new faces, very few returning. They're getting Maxime Renaud back, and he's fantastic. I'd be remiss to not mention his return. He's an excellent player that is coming back for the Stanford program, and that's going to help them a bunch. But this is not a roster that looks great on paper, but Kyle Smith's done more with less in the past, and I wouldn't be surprised if he does that again here. I project them to finish outside the top 10 in the ACC, but wouldn't be stunned if they push up into that 9-8 range potentially as well. Well, Stanford and Cal, we'll talk about it. They had nearly identical records last season, and is that going to be the case again? Can Cal keep up with Stanford as they both make that move into the ACC? We're going to talk Cal hoops in just a second. Right after I tell you all about today's sponsor, Game Time. Folks, minor league baseball season is right in the thick of things, and as somebody who personally lives just 10 minutes away from my local minor league team, I love being able to make a last-minute decision. Hey, I'm going to grab a buddy and we're going to go out to the ballpark and watch a game tonight. And that's why I use Game Time, because prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. So with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. And if you're somebody who's worried that your ticket's going to be fake, that you're going to be turned away at the gate, it's going to be super embarrassing and frustrating for you and your family, one of the great things about Game Time is their purchase is covered by the most flexible customer service policy in the entire ticketing industry. Personally, I love having that peace of mind. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app now, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. You and a friend want to go to a game? Minor league tickets are $12 each. 2 tickets, $24. You can get them for $4. If you go to Locked Game Time, use redeem code LOCKEDONCollege, for $20 off. Terms do apply. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On College Basketball Podcast, and we're still talking ACC basketball here on the show. And folks, if you want more, if you're an ACC fan, you want to learn more about these new teams, you just want to learn more about what's going on with this conference heading into next season, whether it's football, whether it's basketball, whether it's realignment. I already mentioned checking out Locked On College Football for realignment talk with folks. You can also check out Locked On ACC podcast. Fantastic host there, Alex Dono, Kenton Gibbs. They do an incredible job with that show. Highly recommend checking out Locked On ACC if you have not done so yet. Want to talk Cal Golden Bears, Mark Madsen's club here. We're going to talk about this team. They were 13-19 last year. So again, 14-18 for Stanford, 13-19 for Cal. Very close. 9-11 in Pac-12 play. Had a 1 game over Stanford in that final season in the Pac-12. Their KenPom ranking to finish the year was 121, so a few spots behind Stanford there. They did not make the NCAA tournament and have not made it since 2016. Been a while. The Mark Fox era was not good for Cal. They've had some challenges in the department, some apathy from the athletic department, the front office. They're just not really caring too much about men's basketball, caring too much about athletics in general at Cal has been a bit of an issue. So NIL, I think, is something that this program is still really trying to figure out and trying to work through. Haven't made the tournament since 2016. They were a 4 seed that year, but things have kind of gone off the rails ever since. And this team had a lot of talent last year. Mark Madsen comes over from Utah Valley, Stanford alumni, one of the most well-known players and figures in Stanford basketball history. It was shocking that Stanford didn't fire Jerod Haase and hire Mark Madsen last season. They waited an extra year, lost out on the opportunity to hire Mark Madsen, which would have been a home run hire for them. Not only do they miss out on that opportunity, he goes to their longtime rival at Cal. Now, I think Stanford did just fine hiring Kyle Smith. I made that clear in the last segment, but that was still feels like a big missed opportunity to win back some goodwill and kind of generate some serious interest in your men's basketball program by bringing in a storied alumni who also had a ton of success as a head coach at Utah Valley. And Mark Madsen did a really good job at Cal last year. I mean, this team winning 9 games in the Pac-12, that's a big jump from where they were in the last couple of years of the Mark Fox era. This team had a ton of talent on last year's roster, but most of it is gone, unfortunately. Jalen Tyson, 20th overall pick to the Cleveland Cavaliers in the NBA. He's out the door. Dawes Amack is out of eligibility. He is working in the NBA Summer League to see if he can stick around in the association next year. They also lost Jalen Cone and Keontae Kennedy to graduation, 2 veteran guys they brought in via the transfer portal last year. All 4 of these guys were only at Cal for 1 year. You could tell Mark Madsen was like, I need to just replace this roster. He brought in a bunch of veteran guys so that they could have a good year in their first season, final year in the Pac-12. And then he kind of had to do it again because most of these guys ran out of eligibility. They also lose Jalen Celestine. He transfers to Baylor. Isaac and I talked about him a little bit on an episode last week. They also lose Devin Askew, who's been at Kentucky, been at Texas, been at Cal, is now transferred to Long Beach State. It has been quite a trajectory for Devin Askew in his career up to this point, but he is no longer with the Cal program. Now, I really like this transfer portal class for Mark Madsen and the Golden Bears. And I think I probably like this class in terms of just pure talent more than I like the Stanford class, but it's pretty close. A couple additions here for them. Mady Sissoko comes over from Michigan State, guy who never really found his footing consistently in Tom Izzo's program, averaged about 3 points and about 4 rebounds in 124 games for the Spartans. Got plenty of looks, just never really developed into much of an offensive threat. They get Andrej Stojakovic from Stanford, mentioned him earlier, top 40, top 30, I think, guy in the last year's recruiting class. Just wasn't very consistent for Stanford, averaged about 8 points a game, but his efficiency numbers were pretty awful. very curious to see if he can take a sophomore leap and have a really good year for Cal. He's a sneaky upside, like, hey, this guy could be a breakout candidate as a sophomore in a new system for Mark Madsen and the Golden Bears. They get Rightus Patricis from Air Force, averaged about 16.6 boards, 4 assists, 1.5 steals as a sophomore last year for Air Force. Also shot 35% from 3. That might be the winner in this transfer portal class. Incredibly productive player in the Mountain West. A guy I think is going to do some really nice things for this team. They also get Javon Blackshear from Grand Canyon. He played 123 games across his career with the Lopes, averaged 11 points and 3.5 assists. Career 34% three-point shooter. He did shoot about 42% from 3 last year for the Lopes, so definitely a name to keep an eye on there. They also had Joshua Ola-Joseph from Minnesota, 7.5 points, 40% from deep in 2 years with the Golden Gophers. Last edition, Jeff Nwankwo, number 2 ranked junior college player in the entire class, comes from Cowley College. JUCO guys are a bit hit and miss, but if you get one of the top ranked ones, often those guys translate. So it'll be interesting to see how he does with this program. I'm excited about the future of Cal basketball. Mark Madsen is a good coach. He's a good recruiter. He's a good coach. He has done more with less throughout his career. He was very steady at Utah Valley for a half decade, has done a lot of really good things. Just like Stanford, though, it's a program that hasn't put a lot of emphasis into really trying to grow their men's basketball program. It's not something they've cared that much about. We're not seeing a big investment. It could have changed behind the scenes. Who knows if the move to the ACC has invigorated some of that or not, but again, the ACC is kind of in a tenuous spot right now. So I could see athletic departments thinking, okay, are we going to funnel a bunch of money to these programs to, get a lot of NIL talent if in a year from now the ACC falls apart and we're back, it's now the Pac-4 with us and Oregon State and Washington State trying to figure out what the heck to do. Like if there's a real concern for any of these athletic departments that might happen, they're probably not exactly opening up the checkbooks and funneling it out there. And the boosters and the donors, they may not be either. So it'll be interesting to see how kind of held back these programs might be by that. Having said all that, I like this class. I like that Mark Madsen is targeting veteran guys. He's targeting, guys who can come in and help right away on this program. I think the construction of this roster could be really solid next year with some of the guys they have bringing in, a lot of wings, a lot of talented scoring wings coming in. Blackshear's a good passer, a good distributor. Sissoko, maybe not a great low post presence, but he's a decent rebounder and a solid defender and a big body. So I think he's going to help contribute to this team as well. I have Cal potentially finishing a little higher than Stanford. I said I had Stanford just outside the top 10. That's kind of where I have Cal too. I think they could finish as high as 9th or 8th, somewhere in there, but I think of their 11, 12 range. I think they're going to be ahead of some of the teams that I don't love their off seasons, with apologies to Boston College and Virginia Tech and even Georgia Tech. I think they're kind of in that range with Georgia Tech, potentially not quite a top 10 team, but maybe not far behind, maybe sneak into that top 10 conversation for this Cal squad. Well, the ACC didn't just add programs from the former Pac-12. They also added SMU coming from the American Athletic Conference. They hired a former Pac-12 coach, though, so it kind of counts. We're going to talk about Andy Enfield taking over for the Mustangs, what this program looks like as they head into the ACC, all that coming up in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3. Still Andy Patton, still Locked On College Basketball Podcast. We're still talking about the 3 new teams joining the ACC this upcoming college basketball season. We talked Stanford in the first segment, their hiring of Kyle Smith, what that roster looks like heading into this year. We talked Cal in the second segment, Mark Madsen in his second year with the Golden Bears, a very fun transfer portal class for them, but we'll see how it translates. And now we close out the show talking about the non-Pac-12 school that is joining the ACC next year, and that is the Mustangs of Southern Methodist University. They went 20-13 last year, including going 11-7 in the AAC. It was a very good year for Rob Lanier and the Mustangs. They finished 72nd at Ken Palm, much higher than both Stanford and Cal. They did not make the NCAA tournament, did not get an at-large bid, and didn't win the AAC. The last time they made the tournament was 2017 when they were a 6th seed. Very good year for them back then. But after Rob Lanier goes 20-13, nearly leads this team to their first NCAA tournament in 8 years, he gets rewarded by losing his job. He gets fired very shortly after the season. It was a surprising move, and a move that started a coaching carousel domino that is will probably be one of the most remembered and iconic coaching carousels in college basketball history. I feel very confident in making that statement that Rob Lanier getting fired at SMU led to one of the greatest, if not the greatest, coaching carousel in all of college basketball history. Because what happened after that is that SMU hired Andy Enfield from USC, a coach who hadn't gotten fired from USC, although I think USC was maybe trending in that direction after a disastrous season with Isaiah Collier and Bronny James last year. But Enfield leaves before getting fired, potentially, goes to SMU, takes that head coaching job. USC then manages to convince Eric Musselman, the head coach at Arkansas, who had a similarly disastrous year for the Razorbacks last year. Musselman, who's a West Coast guy, he used to coach at Nevada. He likes it out here. They convince him to come out to LA and take over for the USC as they move into the Big Ten. So now you got Andy Enfield heading over to SMU. You got Eric Musselman heading from Arkansas to USC. And then, of course, the big news, the big, huge headline of the offseason, John Calipari, also kind of leaving before he gets fired type of situation. I don't think Kentucky was ever going to fire him, but it was time for John Calipari's tenure with the Wildcats to end. And instead of resigning or stepping down or waiting to get fired, he left, took the head coach job at Arkansas in the SEC. That's going to make for some fascinating matchups over the next couple of years. Calipari's at Arkansas. Of course, Kentucky then hires Mark Pope, who was on that 1996 championship squad coached by Rick Pitino. He was the team captain for them. Also a former Utah Valley head coach. Shout out Utah Valley, getting 2 mentions on today's show, as that is, of course, where Mark Madsen was coaching before he took over at Cal. Mark Pope, also a former Utah Valley coach, was, of course, the coach at BYU prior to getting hired by Kentucky. So SMU firing a 20-win coach in his second season led to John Calipari going to Arkansas, Mark Pope going to Kentucky, Musselman to USC. Crazy coaching carousel. College basketball is fun, isn't it? Anyway, let's get back to what this SMU roster is going to look like this upcoming season. They have some serious key departures, a lot of transfers out the door. Jaheim Hudson goes to Auburn. Tyreek Smith goes to another AAC program in Memphis. Zurich Phelps goes to Texas A&M. Ricardo Wright goes to Kennesaw State. Jalen Smith goes to Rice. Samuel Williamson out the door as well. A lot of talent gone. You're not surprised to see that. Anytime a program has a coaching change, it's pretty common to see 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 guys out the door, hitting the transfer portal, especially in the modern era, of course. But some really, really good transfer portal additions for Coach Andy Enfield. SMU seems to have really, like we're talking about Cal and Stanford being a little stingy, it feels like, with their money, being maybe unwilling to commit to resources for the basketball programs, donors being unwilling to commit to donating money to the NIL collectives. All that stuff seems to be a bit tenuous at those programs. But SMU, from a football and a men's basketball perspective, has just poured it on, and it has resulted in some high-level talent joining their programs as they head into the ACC. Here's a look at some of the key additions for this SMU program out of the transfer portal. They get Matt Cross, small forward coming over from UMass. Cross has been at a couple different schools up to this point in his career. Last year, for the Minutemen, he averaged about 15 points, 8 boards, and 3 assists. The prize of what is a very, very good transfer portal class for Andy Enfield and the Mustangs. They also get Kevin Boopy Miller from Wake Forest. Steve Forbes acquires guards at an elite level in the transfer portal. Hunter Salas got all the attention last year, justifiably so. He was outstanding and is a very real All-American candidate this upcoming season as well. But Boopy Miller was fantastic as well. He came from Central Michigan last year for Forbes and the Demon Deacons. He averaged 15 points, 3.5 assists, 1.5 steals, shot 37% from 3. Now he goes to SMU, stayed in the conference, weirdly enough, as SMU and Wake Forest will face each other this year as members of the ACC. But this is a really nice addition to help replace some of the guard talent out of the door for the Mustangs. They also get Kario Akendo from Oregon. Started his career at Georgia, spent last year with the Ducks, now is in the ACC with SMU. Averaged about 7 points, 2.5 boards, shot 33% from deep for the Ducks. They get Yohan Traore. Yohan Traore, top 25 prospect in the 2022 recruiting class, went to Auburn, had a rough freshman year at Auburn. Barely saw the floor, didn't look particularly good when he did see the floor, just wasn't ready for SEC basketball. So he transferred to Santa Barbara, from the SEC to the Big West, not something you see all that often. And that's where Traore really found himself. 14.5 points a game for the Gauchos, 5 boards, shot just about 60% on 2-pointers. Now he's back at the high major level. He's with SMU. He's in the ACC. I'm really excited to see a third college season for Traore. Does he settle in? Does he kind of find his role? What does that look like? If I haven't made a full list of the transfers I'm most intrigued by, if you guys listened to Monday's episode, you know we talked about transfer portal classes that we're very interested in, talked about Seton Hall, talked about Virginia, but of players I'm interested in, I certainly would have Yohan Traore on the list. I think a lot of people have kind of written him off after such a bad year at Auburn, but he's a guy I'm intrigued to see what he does with another shot at the high major level here at SMU. And then they also have another center they added in the transfer portal, Jarrell Colbert from Kansas State. Played about 11 minutes a game for Jerome Tang's team last year, about 2.5 points, 2.3 boards for him. So another high major guy who's got an opportunity to continue to contribute at that level now in the ACC. I think the SMU is the best team out of these three next year in the ACC. They were the best team last year, according to KenPom, by a pretty good amount, about 50 spots higher than Cal, about 40 spots higher than Stanford. So certainly a team that it's not exactly a bold prediction to say that the team that was way better last year is going to be better again this upcoming year, but they are the team that is technically not coming from a high major program or from a high major conference. They're coming from the American Athletic Conference, which the difference between the AAC and the Pac-12 last year, pretty minimal. So I don't think that's a huge difference necessarily. But obviously, they just like the other two programs, lost a lot of talent, lost a lot of players. But I really like this portal class. I like some of the pieces they kept. I'm not super sold on Andy Enfield. With respect to him, I think I would have him third on this list of coaches. I think the order we talked about them is the order I would rank the coaches: Kyle Smith, Mark Madsen, followed by Andy Enfield. But maybe Enfield can kind of make something work. He had a lot of success at Florida Gulf Coast. He had some success at USC, took him to the NCAA tournament, took him to a couple, they won some games in the Big Dance while he was there. He's not a bad coach. I'm just more confident in the other coaches. Really kind of turned off by what happened at USC last year. Things did not go well for the Trojans with the amount of talent they had on that roster. So I'm very interested to see what he does with a new team, with a new program, new resources, all that stuff. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how he does. I wouldn't project them that high. I don't think any of these teams finish top 5 in the ACC. And frankly, I'd be more surprised if a team finished in the top 5 than I would if all 3 of these teams finish outside the top 10. That feels like a more likely scenario to me. Something like, SMU finishing 11th, Stanford finishing 13th, Cal finishing 16th. Like that feels reasonable to project next year. I also think it's possible that SMU finishes 8th and Stanford finishes 10th or 11th and Cal's like right behind them. Like that could happen. It's going to be really fun to see how these teams acclimate to the ACC. I think a part of this conversation too that could be had for another time is the travel, what that does for these teams. Are they at a disadvantage with having every road trip be a cross-country trip? Like it just feels like there's a lot because they're not hosting a lot of the big name programs over, so it's going to be really interesting to see how the amount of travel that they have to do, how that potentially impacts how these programs adjust to being in the ACC for their first season. It's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Folks, thank you so much for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Once again, special shout out to those everyday listeners and those of you hanging out with us in our Discord. If you have not done so yet, there is a link in the show notes on audio and video platforms. Come hang out. It's free to join. We're talking college hoops all the time. I'll be back with Leaf to Lead on Wednesday's episode, and then Isaac and I will be back to close out the week with you here as we talk recruiting, summer league, transfer portal, everything else going on. We'll get into some Olympic stuff as well. Thanks again for listening, folks. And until next time, as always, peace out.